Okay, take it away. It's all yours, Edward. Thank you.
Can you see things?
Yo, yeah, perfectly. Yep.
All right, I apologize, everyone. I won't repeat all my narrative. I'll simply pull through.
Do whatever you think is best. If you want to go through some of the slides, that's no problem at all. Because a lot of people are saying in the comment, that's fine if you want to start there. So all good. And again, thanks everyone for joining us.
Then I will start over a little. I'll start over the first part. The presentation is about education. We all start with what we're taught, and what we're taught is that the system never changes and is always right. So when someone says to us, sit down or stay off the grass, as someone said to young Pastor King at the seminary, and he said, you're going to have to come and make me, or stop talking, stop yelling. It takes a heck of a lot of oxygen to talk. That's from the transcript of the police who murdered George Floyd. Or whatever they say. We think they know best until one day we realize that they don't. And then our education begins. Every day, women and men become legends. Sins that go against our skin become blessings. The movement is a rhythm to us. Freedom is like religion to us. That's why Rosa sat on the bus. That's why we walk through Ferguson with our hands up. When they go down, we women and man up. They say, stay down. We stand up. Shots we on the ground. The camera panned up. King pointed to the mountaintop, and we ran up. MLK learning the life. You see him here, an image of him on the 2015 cover of the New Yorker, with from left to right, Earl Garner, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and King. So think for a moment about what we know about Dr. King. It's about his education. Like the rest of us, he's educated into not whiteness exactly, but into a formalized way of cultural thinking, what we might call a habitus, a thought habit. Like everyone here, he had his learning to do. He was good at what he did. He was a fabulous pool player. And as I said before, he was always well-dressed. He had a great deal of self-respect. He did not like being arrested and wept when he was, but he did it. So we sentimentalize the man to our peril. He's not always a radical, not always a pacifist, if ever he really was. For the first years of his life, he carried a pistol for self-defense, his public life. He read, he walked, he listened, he prayed. Pastor King, Mike to his friends most of his life, taught himself to respect himself. This is how he did it. He writes of his teen years, I had learned of the inseparable twin of racial injustice was economic justice. So at Atlanta's Morehouse College as a freshman in 1944, my concern for racial and economic justice was already substantial. During my student days, I read Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience. Fascinated by the idea of refusing to cooperate with an evil system, I was so deeply moved I reread the work several times. Martin Luther King was 15 at the time. The year before this, he writes a letter as a freshman at Morehouse College. We want and are entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens. The right to earn a living at work for which we are fitted by training and ability. Equal opportunities in education, health, recreation, similar public services. The right to vote, equality before the law. Some of the same courtesy and good manners that we ourselves bring to all human relations. This letter by the sophomore at the school was published in the Atlantic Constitution in 1946. The young man is 16 at the time. He writes about Crozier Theological Seminary that is where he began his serious intellectual quest for method to eliminate social evil. And I pause again, he's 19 when he's thinking these things. I turned to a serious study of the social and ethical theories of the great philosophers from Plato, Aristotle, Rousseau, Hobbes, Bentham, Mill, and Locke. And all these masters stimulated my thinking, such as it was. And while finding things to question in each of them, I nevertheless learned a great deal from their study. So as we see, while he considers the intellectual influences that shaped his philosophy, He discusses the impact made upon his thinking by Thoreau and Nietzsche and Marx and Aristotle, Rauschenbusch, famous American reverend of the social gospelers, and Gandhi. But he never mentions reading Jefferson, Thomas. He never mentions reading Washington's letters in which he talks about exterminating the indigenous. He never considers the first president's dentist bills and wonders why he's paying his enslaved person's money for their teeth. Though he's on record with giving Jefferson and Washington praise. Perhaps he should have read more on these, but then again, he knew about them what we were told we knew. It's what the system gives us. But the learning he would get later. The image on the right is an image of where Sally Hemings, how do you say it? She wasn't the kept mistress, she was an enslaved 14-year-old child who came to Jefferson's estate at in Monticello as a child, the half-wife of his legally married wife. She was 3/4 European. She was an enslaved person. She was the father of at least five, possibly six enslaved children under Thomas. And this secret room, which was recently rediscovered, was right down the hall behind a bathroom in Thomas Jefferson's own room. And of his learning at Crozier, King writes, "It's my conviction ever since reading Rauschenbusch that any religion that professes concern for the souls of men and is not equally concerned with the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that strangle them, the social conditions that cripple them, is a spiritually moribund religion, only waiting for the days to be worried." It's been well said, a religion that ends with the individual ends. 5 years after his doctorate in systematic theology from Boston University, Rosa Parks is arrested for refusing a bus driver's order in Montgomery, Alabama, 1st of December, 1955. He's 24. About this event, King reflects, "I came to see for the first time that the Christian doctrine of love operating through the Gandhian method of nonviolence was one of the most potent weapons available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. Montgomery was ruthlessly segregated, but it gave the now doctor, Pastor King, a place to practice." Less than a month and a half later, while King speaks at a meeting, his home is bombed for the first time. His wife and daughter are not injured. He had just turned 26. Mohandas Gandhi, the great soul. As a first-year student at the seminary, King hears Howard University's famous president, Mordecai Johnson, lecture on Gandhi. He later says, in the early days of the Montgomery bus boycott, he refers to India's Mahatma Gandhi, and Mahatma is Gandhi's name. Mohandas is the title meaning great soul. He refers to Mahatma Gandhi as the, quote, guiding light of our technique of nonviolent social change. Gandhi was a bit, as I said, like King in the sense of self-respect, presented always well. And you see below the picture of Gandhi as an attorney and picture to the left. He had been sent to Britain basically to become a law degree, to return to India as an agent of the colonial power. On his way to his first job in South Africa, he was told to sit in the segregated car in the train, which so outraged him that he had gone on a year contract and basically spent 23 years here fighting the system. And one of his most famous is the Salt March, which takes place in 1930, the image on the left. During the march, thousands of Indians followed Gandhi a distance of some 240 miles. You see him here in the center. This is the image that is in DC's Gandhian memorial. The march resulted in the arrest of nearly 60,000 people, including Gandhi himself. India would be finally granted its independence in 1947, the year before the younger King is graduating from college. And on the right, you see the image of the procession parade, the pilgrimage of persons following Gandhi. The point I make here about the SALT Act of 1882, to put this in the context, This prohibited Indians from collecting or selling salt without some kind of tax from Britain. And it had the social and political affront that the Tax Act, that the Tea Act had in the United States colonials. So in my pilgrimage to nonviolence, King writes, prior to reading Gandhi, I had about concluded that the ethics of Jesus were only effective in individual relationships. The turn the other cheek philosophy and the love your enemies were only valid, I thought, when individuals were in conflict with other individuals, when racial groups and nations were in conflict. But after reading Gandhi, I saw how utterly mistaken I was. And the image on the right is on a pilgrimage to India in 1959. Dr. King stops at the Samadhi, the cemetery, the burial cremation site of Gandhi. He says, Gandhi was probably the first person in history to lift the love ethic of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective social force on a larger scale. And this is the critique of Christianity that he will hold all of his life. Mike King is 19 at this time when he's reading Gandhi. The image of King on the right is taken. He always respected other persons, and even like in his letter to Morehouse at Morehouse College, he talks about the respect and dignity for other human persons. And here here in the following image, you see Dr. King, Reverend Dr. King, without his shoes as they approach the Samadhi. Gandhi's satyagraha, the force of truth, that oppressed people could use truth or love as weapons in the struggle for justice. King appreciated it, but he didn't find a practical application for how to put it to use until he became involved in Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 56. Some years later, he comes back and he's reflecting on that pilgrimage to India. And in Ebenezer Baptist Church, where he was a pastor, he and his father were pastors, his sermon on Mahatma Gandhi, I am an untouchable. Recalling his pilgrimage, King comments about a speech he was invited to give to a high school. The principal introduced me, and then as it came to the conclusion of his introduction, he says, young people, I would like to present to you a fellow untouchable from the United States of America. The Dilat, with the word in Indian or Hindu. And for a moment, I was a bit shocked and peeved that I would be referred to as an untouchable. And this is probably, if you want to put it this way, this is one of the moments that King came to a kind of awakening awareness of what he was called to do and how he was called to do it. I started thinking about the fact 20 million of my brothers and sisters were still smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. I started thinking about the fact these 20 million brothers and sisters were still, by and large, housed in rat-infested, unendurable slums in the big cities of our nations, still attending inadequate schools faced with improper recreational facilities. And I said to myself, yes, I am an untouchable. And every Negro in the United States of America is an untouchable. So these next few images show images that probably most of us are familiar with. King's extracurricular education completes what a life in philosophy and books had begun. Here you have images from the Birmingham's Children's Crusade. You have Bull O'Connor's police at the bottom two images, turning fire hoses and dogs on the children. Selma, Alabama, the March to Montgomery, March 7th, 1965, the first abortive march with 600 people led by this man here in the corner, John Lewis, who was 25 at the time. You see Dr. King. It was a flip of a coin that John Lewis would be the one who would represent the head of the line. King is here. The work up to this, King leading a group of civil rights workers in Selma, citizens in prayer on February 1st, 1965, after which they were arrested. And shown here, you see Dr. King kneeling behind and as they sing. More than 250 persons were arrested as they marched to the Dallas County Courthouse as a part of a voter registration drive. Again, Bull O'Connor, John Lewis. This is the image of the woman, you'll see her later, who was knocked out by the police on that march. So the images mount and they mount. And you see the 63 March for Jobs and Freedom in Washington. And the title is important. It's not just I Have a Dream speech. It was an official march for jobs and for freedom, economics, as well as liberty. And you see further on the right images of King becoming increasingly progressively radicalized in terms of the Viet Nam War. You see down in the corner, King never took other person's word. So here he's going door to door in Mississippi, talking about voting. Injustice anywhere as a threat to justice everywhere. In the Birmingham jail, he was chided by a group of ministers who said, "Why is this outsider here in our place, rousing everyone up?" King was restless for learning, and it took him away from the pieties of liberal America. You see an image over here on the left, the letter to in Birmingham jail, written by Dr. King. So, and after Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, which we heard part of it a little bit at the beginning of today's presentation, delivered at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called King, quote, "the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security." Those are his words. The road to the Lorraine Motel, room 306, begins here. Something that I don't have written here, but I will say this. Hoover orchestrated a campaign of letters and tapes and sent them to King and his wife, purporting to be letters of various sexual dalliances, as he intended to discredit. The point that I made about the road to the Lorraine Motel, every act of social violence is authorized at some level by some person. An interesting image on the right. Barack Obama, First Lady Michelle Obama, daughters Sasha, Malia, with former President George Bush, First Lady Laura Bush, prior to walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery Civil Rights March, March 7th, 2015. An official White House photo by Lawrence Jackson. Why is this important? The Honorable John Lewis, Amelia Boynton Robinson, this woman here, John Lewis here. The White House photo, as much as I might be a fan of that particular White House, they didn't have the presence of mind to put the people in it whose names belonged in it. This is an aside in what John Lewis learned. John Lewis in his iconic trench coat. This is the 2-minute warning that the militia gave him. You have 2 minutes to disperse. This is him as they're walking along the street. John Lewis is 25 at this particular time, untutored, but committed. This is John Lewis. He has a fractured skull from this. "50 years later, he writes, we can all do something. So I say to you, don't give up on the things of great meaning to you. Don't get lost in a sea of despair. Stand up for what you believe. Because in the final analysis, we are one people, one family, the human family. We all live in the same house, the American house, the world house. We're Black, we're white, we're Hispanic, Asian American, Native American, but we're one people." Delivered March 7th, 2015, Edmund Pettus Bridge. Here's an image from a different angle. This is the Honorable Lewis's final ride across the Pettus Bridge and his funeral cortege. The one that a former president wouldn't attend. Honor the local people of Selma. Edmund Pettus Bridge, whose history itself is both racist and Confederacy, moves closer to being renamed after John Lewis. The Guru, Pastor King. Guru is a Hindu word meaning the teacher. An interesting aside. So when Lewis graduated from high school, he writes a letter to Martin Luther King, Jr., pastor then, Pastor King, who at the time was a young minister from Atlanta, sowing the seeds of the civil rights movement, perhaps. Not only did Pastor King write back to Lewis, he also included in the letter a round-trip bus ticket to Montgomery and an invitation to meet him, which Lewis eventually did. That's good teaching. The image on the bottom. John Lewis's education began in Nashville, at the University of Nashville, as a first-year student. He's being carried away and arrested at 17. He was arrested 40 times. Dr. King was arrested 30 times. Lewis was arrested before he was a representative. He was arrested after he was representative. Good trouble, an expression that John Lewis would use often, and I think actually that he takes this from Harriet Tubman. King, reading Gandhi, reading Thoreau. And when there is the possibility of a storm, if you want change in your life, walk into it. If you get on the other side, you will be different. And if you want change in your life and you're avoiding the trouble, you can forget it. Wade on in the water. It's going to really be troubled water. So Harriet would say. This comment from Harriet Tubman is interesting because she's essentially quoting the first book of Genesis when he talks about the spirit of the Lord troubling the waters. So unless one has a familiarity with that particular text, the use of the word troubled water here has a wider connotation. This is an expression that John Lewis would use often, and he plays back and forth with it. So King was learning good trouble before Gandhi taught him, and this is partly what I'm trying to do this afternoon. He was learning from the same person who taught Gandhi, an American writer, famous in retrospect for all the wrong things. And I think if I had to say a point of my presentation this afternoon, this is it. Henry David Thoreau, fiery abolitionist, a legal vigilante, has been, in a word, erased. He's been colonized by, well, I don't know what. I'm speaking from somebody, as somebody with a degree in American Studies from Duke University. And the text on the right is the text that your typical American Studies student will get, civil disobedience. But there's more, as we'll see. In 1942, Gandhi writes American supporters, "You've given me a teacher in Thoreau who furnished me through his essay, scientific confirmation of what I was doing in South Africa." Well, I actually took the name of the movement from Thoreau's essay on the duty of civil disobedience. But there's more with Thoreau. The whitewashing of Thoreau, like King, is a cottage business. And I'm going to kind of repeat this because I think this is central to what I'm trying to do here, is that as we are thinking about education, as we're thinking about history and the expression of critical race theory, and which is another way of talking about a simple re-looking at history in the way that it happened, Thoreau and King have both been, I'll say it, whitewashed, with much invested, quote, in bringing them back into the fold. Thoreau did not actually teach nonviolence as a goal. What did he teach? He taught resistance to bad government. His particular issue was enslavement. In fact, he was at his sharpest about enslavement and the passive pieties of white Americans, and Lincoln would be one of those later white Americans that he, in terms of the way he held and thought things about the enslaved persons. And Thoreau had no patience with this. He said that all would be well in time. Following John Brown's raid on the armory in Harper's Ferry, months before the Civil War started, Thoreau condemned the passivity of people around him. What is the character of that calm which follows when the law and the slaveholder prevail? The slave ship is on her way, crowded with its dying hundreds. A small crew of slaveholders is smothering 4 millions under the hatches. And in the same breath, they tell us that all is quiet now at Harper's Ferry. What is that I hear cast overboard? The bodies of the dead who have found deliverance. That is the way we are diffusing humanity and all of its sentiments with it. I guarantee you that Dr. King had not read that. So while revisionists get Thoreau and On the Duty of Civil Disobedience wrong, King got Thoreau right, kind of, I think, by accident. Thoreau resisted. That is an action. Nor was he a pacifist. This is Dr. King. I became convinced that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. No other person has ever been more eloquent and passionate in getting this idea across than Henry David Thoreau. As a result of his writings and personal witness, we're the heirs of a legacy of creative protest. So King here echoes Rosa Parks, who gave Pastor King an opportunity to practice his preachment. She remarked to someone who said that she was tired and wouldn't stand up on the bus, sit down on the bus, "I was not tired physically. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in." This is what Pastor King learned from Thoreau. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it. And you also see that Gandhi actually takes the same aspect of Thoreau. And fascinated by the idea of refusing to cooperate with an evil system, I was so deeply moved that I reread the work several times. Again, this is Dr. King as a freshman at Morehouse College. So King learned from Thoreau first that resistance is a kind of violence, good trouble in John Lewis's and Harriet Tubman's expression. It's not passivity. Quote, under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also in prison. That was said by Thoreau, but it could have been said by any one of the three. On the left, H.D. Thoreau again, let every man make known what kind of government would command his respect, and that will be one step toward obtaining it. What I meant about Dr. King early on about he knew his respect. True evil may exist systemically, as in the case of slavery, but this evil can only continue with the tacit approval of individuals. Again, rare is the American Studies major or Ph.D. in this case, who has ever taught this in school. On the right side, Gandhi in prison. An evil administration never deserves allegiance. This is Gandhi, again from Thoreau. Allegiance to it means partaking of the evil. A good man will therefore resist an evil system or administration with his whole soul. Disobedience of the laws of an evil state is therefore a duty. Again, Gandhi, but the law is not respectable. I do not respect the law. How Pastor King learned life. They say, stay down, we stand up. Frankly, I have never engaged in any direct action movement which did not seem ill-timed. That was Dr. King to President Kennedy in 1963. Kennedy was advising him possibly that they should put off the March on Washington because it was ill-timed. Frankly, I have never engaged in any direct action movement which did not seem ill-timed. Kennedy later came around, Kennedy himself would then later said to his own advisors, who said to him, you need to go slowly on what King called, the toxicity of gradualism. He said, you need to go slow on civil rights. And the president was said to have said, that's okay for you because you have your rights. So the trajectory of Reverend King's life is rather spiral, and I do apologize for trying to compress so much of material into, say, an hour and 15 minutes. The later King recalls the younger, hungry student who skipped 2 grades and who enrolled in Morehouse College when he was 15 and had perfect grammar, as we see. The purpose of education. He writes this for the student newspaper when he's 18. It seems to me that education is a twofold function to perform in the life of man and of society. The one is utility, the other is culture. Education must enable a man to become more efficient, to achieve with increasing facility the legitimate goals of his life. Education must also train one for quick, resolute, effective thinking. To think incisively and to think for oneself is very difficult. We are prone to let our mental life become invaded by legions of half-truths, prejudices, and propaganda. The boy is 18 when he writes that. Non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as cooperation with good, he writes in Stride Towards Freedom in 1958. This becomes for King the legitimate goal of his life, borrowing from the letter of the 10 years previous. In 1956, Dr. King was first arrested as a reprisal for the Montgomery bus boycott. You see his mugshot in the middle, 70, 89. He's 26. In 1958, the images on both sides, he is charged with vagrancy and loitering. And the point here needs to be made is that the charge for vagrancy was a post-Civil War law for the control of the former enslaved persons who were, at least on paper, certain rights, but who actually now had a whole new legal structure of apartheid called Jim Crow laws. So the law that he's charged with here is one of those vestiges. Somewhat to the side, the point of, I want you to notice that, again, that Dr. King always presented himself and always had a sense of how he looked. In pursuit of non-cooperation, King would be arrested over 30 times in the next 13 years, and the images are astonishing. Bottom left. In the years 66, 67, King becomes increasingly vocal on the immorality of the Vietnam War, and he links it precisely with the work that he's been doing. Image on the right, you see Dr. King seated next to a police dog being returned to prison in St. Augustine, Florida. Image on the top. Needs no expression. Bull O'Connor again, fire hoses on the children, Children's Crusade. So the Christian King had learned from the Hindu Gandhi that firm rejection of individualism of love, and from the principled resistance of an American abolitionist. From all this, he understood his own engagement to a darker history. And he became more radicalized in this as he understood more that particular history, and we'll see. In prison, he writes, and this is in the letter from Birmingham, any religion where religion ends with that individual, any religion where religion is ending with the individual self ends. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So his education will take Pastor King into the streets, as we saw in the streets of Mississippi, into the streets of Alabama, into the streets for the Vietnam War, into the streets in Birmingham and Montgomery. And eventually it would take him back into the pulpit, into a very famous church, the Riverside Church, funded and raised by Rockefellers. Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence. 4th of April, 1967. This is a year before his death. This was the speech that this one and his later one, The Other America, that formally ruined, if I want to say it that way, kind of white America's devotion to this man. I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice. I deem it of signal importance to try to state clearly, and I trust concisely, why I believe that the path from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where he was first received as a minister, the church at Montgomery, Alabama, Ebenezer, where I began my pastorate, leads clearly to this sanctuary tonight. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. So in this historic church, built with Rockefeller money, King starts quietly. The calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. And I consider this young man had been posting things for other people to read from the time he was 15 years old. He clearly had a vocation. And he reminded the congregation that the war was being disproportionately fought by America's black and brown boys who lacked the means of many of their white contemporaries to avoid the draft. This is his quote. We were taking the black young men who'd been crippled by our society and sending them to 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found themselves in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of these boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent. And again, to continue the circle, King's words echo Thoreau, 111 years earlier, who similarly makes the point about class. Read white privilege. Nations are thus ready to talk of wars and challenge one another. Will it not be thought disreputable at length? Because they are made up to such an extent of poor, low-spirited, despairing men in whose eyes the chance of shooting somebody else without being shot themselves exceeds their actual good fortune. Who in fact will be the first to enlist, but those the most desperate class, those who have lost all hope. The economic complicity of race, as we see, was not a new theme for King. At Morehouse College, the student King wrote a paper declaring that racial injustice and economic justice were inseparable. While dating Coretta Scott, actually whom he met on a blind date, he writes, I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. She had sent him a copy of Looking Backward by Rebellion and asked for his comment. He responds in a letter, I'm much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic, adding that capitalism, quote, outlived its usefulness, quote, because it had brought about a system that takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. He was 23 when he wrote that. And 11 years later in Washington, D.C. in 1963, he would return to the theme, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It's a title that's not often used, and I think partly that is on purpose because I would rather focus it on Martin Luther's heroic I Have a Dream and not on the structural work that he was doing. It's a march on Washington, and actually it's a march on Washington for jobs that had been started with the NFL's, the CIO, back in the early 40s, and they put it off for various reasons. Excuse me. But it was a job purposely for economics, jobs and freedom. So the word revolution, to turn again, to recover. So we're going to end where we began, in the education into life, the education into the philosophy of education, which is unrest. A month before his murder, King calls the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He urges support for, quote, a genuine revolution of values that centers collective liberation and revolt against oppressive systems. Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometime hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty and racism and militarism. One recalls here the language of Jesus's disciples when Jesus makes a comment and his disciples saying, these are hard sayings, who can listen to them? And then they left. This was precisely, and this is now a month before the Reverend King is murdered. For the whole last year of his life, his refusal to be silent on these issues agitated and moved away much of the earlier praise that he'd received. And he increasingly refused silence. He quotes, I answered a man the other day who told me I should stick to civil rights and not deal with the war thing and the war question in Vietnam. I told him that I'd been fighting too long and too hard now, against segregated public accommodations to end up segregating my own moral concerns. And the other thing is, we've got to come to see that however much we're misunderstood or criticized for taking a stand for justice or for peace, we must do it anyway. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Riverside Church, April 4, 1967, a year before Dr. King is killed. Arc of the moral covenant. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I put that in blue there because actually that's an echo of theology that Dr. King himself remembered through much of his life. In his last lines there, he shows how his understanding, his personal history is entangled in that of a disordered country. Because here King echoes his beginnings in American Revolution with the Reverend Theodore Parker. We'll come back to that in a minute. But King's radicalism is not one note. His learning was capacious, his intellect restless. He had read his history, even if he had to read between the approved lines. Our nation was born in genocide, but embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. And pause, this is a reading of the Declaration of Independence, and quote what Jefferson calls the savage natives. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles of racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe its indigenous nation. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. And indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore, all exalted. Why we can't wait. The astonishing thing for me, after 1948 and the Holocaust experience and the United Nations decree on genocide, this is the first time in the latter half of the 20th century that that word, I think, one hears in public, and it was used by this man. So King returns to the original sin, colonial, after a time that brings us here, and later the revolution that began in the late 1840s and the delaying tactics on enslavement. Because as a matter of fact, abolition and all the what we would then now call the fugitive slave law was meant to delay the Civil War. And all it did was not delay, but to end it. But all it did was to put it off. So the final most important connection that joins Thoreau and King and Gandhi is the colonial enslavement, first by Britain and Spain and France and other colonial Europeans, of America's first peoples and Black Americans. The document on the right, an astonishing text, Slavery in Massachusetts by Henry David Thoreau. Who knows this text? Who ever reads this text? The degrees one might have in American studies. So King's connection with Thoreau deepens here because Thoreau, like King, is misremembered. His radicalness and violence erased. Theodore Parker, who was the first one to say, the arc of the moral covenant. It's a line from one of his sermons. So Parker, when you see Parker here with next to Brother Douglas and Louis May Alcott, is a close associate of Thoreau. Reverend Parker was one of the Secret Six who funded John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry just shortly before the Civil War. He was a friend and confidant of Frederick Douglass. He thought that the enslavement of Blacks was a monstrous violation of God-given right to freedom and self-development. And on the right, you see a poster of after the fugitive slave law in 1850, the 1850 Compromise, which again was intended to try to end the argument for a civil war, that give the South what they wanted, that even Northerners could be deputized to return enslaved persons as property back to their owners. Thoreau would have nothing with this. This man had nothing to do with this. Thoreau, nor him. So King will paraphrase the Reverend Parker often. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Parker's comment or Parker's quote is below. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by consciousness, by conscience. And from what I see, I'm sure it bends towards justice. I like the poet in Dr. King. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The image is President Obama's office. This quote, Dr. King's quote, is here, engraved into the rug. And if you want change in your life and you're avoiding the trouble, you can forget it. Wade on in the water. It's going to really be troubled water. Rosa Parks smiling at her booking. Theodore Parker, The Arc of the Moral Universe. Pastor King. Barack Obama. And this man, whom I think does not get as much credit as he deserves. The 25-year-old John Lewis, arrested 40 times. So a final aside to history and to what Dr. King would call amazing grace. The boy was born Michael King, January 15th, 1929. The man, Martin Luther King, was shot dead April 4th, 1968. He was 39. So how'd this work? In 1934, Michael King Sr., the Reverend Michael King Sr., was sent as a convention member for the Southern Baptist to a conference in Germany. This is the year now after This is the year after the Nazis had taken over the government illegally, by the way, through democratic means with Hitler. He was so, and he heard there, Reverend King heard the story of Martin Luther, who in 1521 was called before the Diet of Worms, as they called it, to explain his radical theories and his disagreement with Catholicism. And the father was so impressed by the man's fortitude, this small monk's fortitude, that he came back and renamed both himself and the boy Martin Luther. Martin Luther King Jr., MLK, as he called himself, never actually started using the name until he was about 17 or 18. And it didn't, the birth certificate wasn't changed until probably 1957. And it wasn't legal until 1958. Here you see Martin Luther Jr. and Martin Luther King, Ebenezer Baptist Church, Montgomery, where he shared the pastorate. An interesting note here, he used the expression MLK or ML, and he said it was because if you did not give white people your name, they couldn't call you, they couldn't just demean you. So you used your initials. Hier stehe ich kann nicht anders, God help me, Amen. Martin Luther, before the papal evidence in 1521, the Diet of Worms. My conscience leaves me no other choice. The Reverend Dr. King, March 10th, 1968, a month before he is murdered. Mike, as he was called throughout his life by his friends, had been practicing since he was a 5-year-old to become Martin Luther. In 1948, on the other side of the globe, Mohandas Gandhi, Mohandas, the expression great soul, the funeral cortege, his antiesti, his final sacrifice. Gandhi's comment, the good you do might be insignificant, but it's important that you do it. King is 19. We want and are entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens, the young king. The right to earn a living at work for which we are fitted by training and ability. Equal opportunities in education, health, recreation, similar public services. The right to vote, equality before the law. Some of the same courtesy and good manners we ourselves bring to all human relations. April 9th, 1968. The Reverend King's body carried in a plain white coffin, plain wood coffin, with 2 mules. 400,000 persons, 4 miles long, processed through the city behind the cortege. To put this into perspective, there were 250,000 persons in 1963 in Washington, D.C. And the other thing is, we've got to come to see that however much we're misunderstood or criticized for taking a stand for justice or for peace, we must do it anyway. Sure, the year before he was killed, he was invited to a Glenwood High School in Cleveland, and he says to the children, and so every Black person in this country must rise up and say, I'm somebody. I have a rich, proud, and noble history, however painful and exploited it has been. I am Black and beautiful. The Reverend Martin Luther King, April 26, 1967. The image on the left is the Memphis sewage strike, which was in 1967, which was another radicalization for Dr. King. And Robert, that's my evening. The biggest weapon is to stay peaceful, from Gloria Common and John Legend. Thank to all you who teach with your lives and your practice. This is our life, we're learning together. I have time for questions, Robert.
Okay, give me a few seconds and I will. There were some already that you answered, but give me a few seconds and I'll go through those. If anyone has any question for Edward, feel free to type it in the chat or the Q&A. And Edward, outstanding as always. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. If you joined us late, we have been recording this program. I'll send out the link to the recording. I'll probably have to do that tomorrow, though. And then also I'll include the link of Ed's many other programs that he's been kind enough to do for our group. You received a lot of kudos throughout the program for your presentation.
I'm happy to explain, and I do apologize for compressing what's an astonishing life into an hour and a half.
That's no, Edward, that's no problem on the compression. Let's see, there was a question from Jackie. She asked, can you repeat again the process of how his name got changed from Michael to Martin in terms of the motivation?
The Reverend King Sr., a Baptist minister, was sent as a conventioner for the Baptist Church, and he went to Germany.
If you have any questions, don't call Ed on the phone. Just type them in the chat or the Q&A.
So the father went to Germany and in 1934, where this is again just as the Nazis had taken over the country. But one of the experiences was he followed and began to learn the history of Martin Luther and what he had done in terms of resisting the papacy and the church. And so in 1521, when Martin Luther, the monk, posted his 95 Theses on the church door and was later called before the Pope to announce this. And he says, "Ich kann nicht anders, ich stay here, I cannot do this." So that was the expression that Martin Luther King Jr. used very often in the later years of his life. The father was so touched by this and so struck by it that in 1934, he renamed himself and the child Martin Luther. The process did not legally get taken care of in terms of the actual change of the birth certificate until 1956, 57. The boy himself rarely used the name until probably his first or second year in Morehouse College.
Okay.
Actually, one sees it first on a letter to his mother from Morehouse, MLK.
Okay. Then there was a question, was there any ramifications for his house getting bombed? Did like anyone get in trouble or go to jail, or did they ever find out who did those things? Do you
No,
know?
no. And that was the time that he was carrying a weapon for self-defense.
Yeah, I mean, people did a lot worse things than bombing houses and didn't
Well,
get
yes,
in trouble
in
either.
Birmingham, as a matter of fact, that they bombed the church. The famous issue of the church bombing, where 4 children were killed right after. I think it was September of '63. He was no stranger to violence. It occurred all around him.
And then, so there was a question from someone earlier. They wished to remain anonymous. They confessed that they hadn't seen the Selma movie, but they were going to watch it. And what were your thoughts on the film before they see it?
Yes, see it.
Okay, good.
It's a much better history than I'm giving you here, but they were very faithful to the history. And you're going to see the young John Lewis, and you're going to see Wilson. You're going to see the John Wilson character. And I've kind of grown in my estimation of John Lewis through presentation, through this presentation. But do see Selma.
Okay. There's a few other films about him as well that are, I'd say, I don't know, above average if I had to categorize them. And again, if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to type those in the chat or the Q&A section in Zoom, or the comment section if you're watching us on Facebook. Just getting a lot of thanks and kudos, and appreciate your time, Edward, just to pass that along to you. And then Edward, if you wouldn't mind, would you be able, they're not on our calendar just yet. Would you mind telling folks about some of the other programs that you're going to have coming up in the near future? Because those will be on our calendar in the next few days. And I'll include that information when I send off the link for the recording and that type of stuff.
Where do we start?
Start anywhere you want.
Chemistry and the law enforcement, or the sixth extinction and the apocalypse, sixth extinction and the Anthropocene, reparations presentation on Mexico and the reparations of Mexicans in California. Another series in the enslaved about the Franciscan missions, the Spanish missions in California. How Jesus became a white person and was adopted by the Confederacy. I mean, Robert, I can just go on, as you know, so.
Okay, no problem. What about, here's a question from Paul about, he wants to know, did the attacks, the physical attacks that Martin Luther King had, in terms of the assault and the getting stabbed, did that have any impact whatsoever on his nonviolence approach?
Well, and I thank you for that question, because I passed over the first assassination attempt in '57, I think was the year, where he was stabbed by a woman with a letter opener. And it occurs to me that I didn't really talk about the gendering politics around this, but how often through so much of this, you see this in terms of kind of the daughters of the Confederacy, where there's a certain gendered position, if you want to put it this particular way, where women end up taking both the responsibility and the burden of doing actions that the men will not do and won't do. And you see this, for example, in 57, 58 in the immigrant segregation, where the men might be driving it, but it's the women who are taking the fall for it. I mean, here's a man with a family. I mean, you know, he was clearly articulate from the time he was 15 years old. And he has a family with children. So one has to, as I say, amazing grace, just simply respect his ability to stay in one place and talk about his notion of nonviolence, as we see, is not the kind of sentimental throw up your hands and, you know, let them attack you, because he didn't believe that. He stayed in my. This is what he learned from Thoreau. And when I said earlier that we sentimentalize this man at our peril, he did not stay down. He stood up. Okay.
And then this also was a question from earlier about the relationship between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And I think some people want to know more about that. But I think one challenge with that is their relationship kind of evolved over time, as did their Malcolm X's kind of philosophy.
They did, and I mean, Malcolm. I was reading Malcolm X's kind of the Republic of New Africa in the South. He would go. His approach was very different. And King was neither Booker T. Washington nor was he W. Du Bois. I mean, but he was a person. I think he knew more American history than the other two, and he was more committed to the flawed nature of American history. And so, I mean, I think his echo of the abolitionists, he doesn't make an issue of this, but even the very sharp pointedness about genocide and the Declaration of Independence, it's an astonishing document. And I don't think the other, sorry?
Oh, no, I didn't say anything. I think there was just some background noise, sorry.
I'm done, thank you.
Oh, okay. What about, when did Martin Luther King go kind of mainstream? You were talking earlier about how, considered very radical during his lifetime and career, but, now he's a very mainstream. Was there like a particular event that caused that to happen, or was this kind of gradual over time, you think?
I think he's being colonized, sorry.
Mm-hmm. But was there a specific event that started to cause that to happen, or was it more of a gradual thing, you think?
And after 63, he was exactly where, to personalize this with King having a dream. It's interesting because there was another Nobelist in that crowd, because that was Bob Dylan was providing music for Dr. King and that particular thing. But the more radical in the sense of the word root, he returns to the root of his ideas. He returns to the root of his American history. And he's very much like Thoreau. He says, that when you are in bed with the slaveholder, this is what's happening. And Thoreau, in a quote that I did not read of Thoreau, he said, I would rather our swords be used with blood than rusted. This is Thoreau. This is, so in other words, I think that in the last 3 years of his life, when he's beginning to put teeth around his earlier comments about racial injustice and the economy. So he is in some ways going back to Eisenhower's, beware the military economic triad that is militarizing this country.
Mm-hmm.
And so Kennedy, for example, could not hear that. Johnson would no longer invite King back, but he was kind of like a kept puppy for a while. But then it was like, okay, no, he's gone beyond good manners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were okay with some change to an extent, but not as much as he was.
They were not change about the fact that he was attacking the war in Vietnam.
Okay, let's see.
No, it was not. They couldn't take that. He was connecting the economics of the South and the economics of the North, and he always did both, not just one or the other. He would connect both the northern slums and the southern economics, and he touched that into the war in Vietnam.
Okay. And then this may be a little bit off topic, not sure if you want to touch this one. Someone asked if Gandhi is perceived differently in America than he is in India. That's an interesting question.
It is. Well, as a matter of fact, Gandhi is, as I said, he was an upper crust Indian, and he to his own day, he was a person who understood the need for the caste system. I don't think he ever got over that.
Okay.
I mean, he was as much a, how do we say it? He was a man of, people say, well, Jefferson was a man of his time and so blah, 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 blah. Well, Gandhi was a person of his time too.
Mm-hmm.
That's
okay. All right. Well, I think that does it for today. And again, Edward, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and educating us on. Edward's just a wealth of information on a variety of topics. So appreciate that. Thank you very much. Bravo. And thanks to everyone for taking time out from their day to learn more about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as well. So again, we're recording this program. If you joined us late, I'll be happy. I'll send out the link for it in the near future, but probably not till tomorrow. And again, thanks so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your weekend, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Especially thanks to Edward. Take care.
good night.